When you were talking to reporters last night, you called white supremacy a myth.
Do you believe punctuality is a vestige of white supremacy, Dasha?
Look, 8% increase in white supremacist propaganda last year.
Who's tracking that?
The Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah, the ADL, I don't think is a particularly credible source when they have cherry-picked information.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we're going to be watching an interview between Vivek Ramaswamy and a few NBC journalists, where he takes them to school at every turn. This one is very satisfying and also a lot of great points brought up. So with that, let's get into it.
I have a different view on this than Ron DeSantis. I think he's looking at it in the way that a traditional politician playing and gaming together how many delegates you collect would look at it. I'm looking at it through the lens of what's right for the country. And I think one difference, an area of difference where you see that is when they've eliminated Donald Trump from the ballots in places like Maine and potentially even in Colorado, I was the clearest and first and only one still to state that I would remove myself from those ballots. And I think that many people here appreciate that, but whether or not they appreciate it, that's the right thing to do, to say that if there's going to be election interference, not going through a legal process or otherwise, just one individual in a state like Maine deciding, waking up on a given day and saying that Donald Trump's going to be removed from the ballot, that's the wrong thing for our country. And so I stood up for that just as I was the first and only person to clearly stand up against these politicized prosecutions against Donald Trump. I think it's very different than Ron DeSantis, who's been focused on collecting delegates.
Right, but all of that has helped him in this primary. His numbers have gone up every time these legal threats have come his way.
Look, I'm not a political analyst. I'm a candidate for U.S. president with a vision for this country. But you see the same numbers we do. Well, I'm in this. Dasha, here's my approach to running this race. I'm going to tell people who I am and what I stand for. Share my true convictions. Share it honestly without a filter. And my deal with the voters is you don't have to agree with 100% of what I say to support me. But what you know about me that's different than anybody else, I think in American politics today, certainly in this race, is I will tell you what I believe 100% of the time. And I think that that's a longer sales cycle, right? I think that Iowans, you know this well, wait until the end. They're very thoughtful about making their decisions. They're evaluating people almost as a job interview. And that's what this is. This is a job interview to be the next U.S. president. And I've not seen people anywhere in this country as thoughtful as Iowa about taking that process really seriously. So I think in the next 10 days is when a lot of those people will be making their final decisions. And my bet is they're going to reward the candidate who has been frank, who has been brutally direct with them through this process, not treating it as a political horse race analyst. The questions you're asking are fair questions Tasha should ask to a candidate. I think most other candidates think about it this way. What's being reflected in the poll numbers? Is what I'm saying working or not? Adjusting accordingly. That's what traditional politicians do, not me. I would rather share my true convictions and lose this race than to win by playing that political snakes and ladders. So I'm just not doing that because I think it drains my inner core out of me if I were to be doing it. I prefer to bring, people use the word authenticity. What does it mean? Just tell people what you believe. Be unvarnished about it. Don't worry about what that's going to do to you in the polls or not. My whole bet in this campaign is that's actually going to be the most successful approach in the end. My bet is that's going to be the most successful approach here in Iowa at the very end of the process, which is what we're entering right now as well. But if I've told everybody in this state, and if everybody in the state really knows who we are as a family and what we stand for, and then they decide to go after somebody else or go for somebody else, I'm at peace with that.
Being at peace with the result. I mean, this is a very powerful and unique message by Vivek. The fact that he's going to serve up the truth and try and be as authentic as possible instead of being politically expedient and let the public do as they will with that. And I like this message because I tend to believe that the truth is an inherently uncomfortable and confronting thing. And people who speak the truth are going to be very confronting and very controversial for that matter. But unfortunately, due to all of the mainstream media propaganda, the narrative is that Vivek Ramaswamy is falling in the polls and Nikki Haley is on the rise. And anybody who's been paying attention will know that this is bullshit.
Nikki Haley, on the other hand, has been surging significantly.
Nikki Haley, who has surged 10 points to 16%, she was the big mover in terms of this poll.
Nikki Haley's the one who's got a little momentum right now.
Yeah. Vivek absolutely wiped the floor with her at every single GOP debate, and the internet was completely behind him. and was laughing at her. This is a poorly manufactured narrative by the mainstream media to prop up a military-industrial complex puppet. The only way I see myself being wrong about this is if the boomer vote is so heavily in favor of Nikki Haley and that all these people are just not on the internet and this is who is influencing the polls. But I doubt it. What I really think is going on here is that Vivek Ramaswamy was just very forthright in his condemnation of war. He said he would cut off the supply to Ukraine, which obviously pissed off the military-industrial complex and all of its benefactors. Just quickly, guys, before we get to the next bit, make sure before this video ends, if you like what we're doing here, chuck a thumbs up on the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Back to the clips. And then he said he wouldn't fund Israel.
No aid to Israel, at least until we have clear answers of what exactly are the objectives of that ground invasion, which I have serious concerns about.
And we know how powerful the Israel lobby is. So that was campaign suicide. And the moment that, for me, despite the overwhelmingly positive response that he got from the real world, the establishment decided that he was too much of a liability. I actually think that when he started to get a lot of traction, they actually liked it because they thought this guy could potentially knock Trump off and maybe he could be controlled. But then I think they soon came to realize that he's more radical than Trump. Maybe I'm wrong. That's how I see it. On to the next.
In a lot of ways, you have been unvarnished about some of these hot topics in the news right now. You have said that you would pardon former President Trump. It would be a day one pardon. Why do you think that's the best decision for the country?
I think it's the best decision for this country for two reasons. One is those prosecutions are themselves politicized and using unprecedented legal theories that obviously would never have been levied unless there was a political motivation at issue, which is to eliminate Donald Trump from contention. I also think it's the right thing to do to unite this country and move our country forward. I do believe I am the single best equipped candidate to lead this country forward, unite the country, not through some fake national unity of compromising on principles and having a split the baby difference on some policies. No, that's not how I'm going to unite the country. I think the way I'll unite this country is by standing for the shared ideals that actually unite all of us as Americans that set this country into motion in 1776. And one of those is one standard of the rule of law, and another is that we, the people, select who leads this country, not unelected bureaucrats. And I will stand for that principle.
So to follow that logic there, would you then potentially ask Republicans to stand down on investigations of President Biden in the spirit of not putting the country through more turmoil?
If they were using unprecedented legal theories to investigate and torture the law to do that, then I would say, then I wouldn't want that in some other fringe personal charge. That's not what's happening now, though, with respect to specifically what's going on in Ukraine. The very country that paid a $5 million alleged bribe to Hunter Biden, this is relevant to the actual policies of the country right now, when that very president is sending $200 billion of our taxpayer money to that same country. If this is affecting our foreign policy, and I'm unsparing with Republicans or Democrats alike, you think about the likes of Nikki Haley and a lot of the foreign dealings and a lot of the military contracting work. If that's actually affecting the policies that affect everyday Americans and the lives of our sons and daughters, that absolutely is an important area for investigation.
What about Hunter Biden, who's not impacting policy? Would you pardon Hunter Biden?
So on this Ukraine charges, I think we need to go all the way to the very bottom of it. I do think it's impacting policy, Dasha.
But Hunter Biden, really the gun charges, the other charges that aren't impacting policy, would you pardon?
The ones that I'm laser focused on and I absolutely would not pardon for, because I think we need to get to the bottom of it if he is convicted, is if that $5 million bribe was indeed paid to him for reasons to influence U.S. policy, and then watching it successfully influence U.S. policy. If that's proven in a court of law, I would not pardon Hunter Biden.
But the charges right now are focused on the gun charges.
Well, where I think they need to be focused is on the essence
But right now, on the gun charges, would you consider pardoning?
I think a lot of that is a deflection, Dasha. I think it's a deflection by the Democrats. I think that they're bringing a thin, flimsy charge on an unrelated matter to deflect the plot away from where the investigation needs to be focused. And so on my watch and at my encouragement, and I've been very clear about this, we need to be crystal clear about whether the Biden family, and I think I have the same concern if it's a Republican in the same shoes, sells off our foreign policy to make their family wealthy. That's wrong no matter who does it, Republican or Democrat. I'm even-handed about that. But I do think that we need to apply one standard of the rule of law. That's not inventing a novel legal theory. That's basics of bribery and affecting our foreign policy. That would be wrong, and if that's proven in a court of law, I would not pardon Hunter Biden for it.
This absolutely blows my hair back to hear these sorts of questions still being asked. Let me help this lady understand here the false equivalence between the case of Hunter Biden and the case of Donald Trump. The Hunter Biden story has been systematically suppressed by the FBI and government agencies. We know this through Mark Zuckerberg admitting that the FBI were in contact with Facebook about suppressing the story.
I mean, basically, the background here is the FBI, I think, basically came to us, some folks on our team, and was like, hey, just so you know, like, you should be on high alert. We thought that there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the 2016 election.
We also know this from the Twitter files. Furthermore, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that crackhead Hunter Biden didn't exactly have the resume to be earning millions of dollars on a giant Ukrainian energy company's board.
Foreign national who allegedly bribed Joe and Hunter Biden allegedly has audio recordings of his conversation with them. 17 such recordings. According to the 1023, the foreign national possesses 15 audio recordings of phone calls between him and Hunter Biden. According to the 1023, the foreign national possesses 2 audio recordings of phone calls between him and then Vice President Joe Biden. These recordings were allegedly kept as a sort of insurance policy for the foreign national in case that he got into a tight spot. The 1023 also indicates that then Vice President Joe Biden may have been involved in bereavement employing Hunter Biden.
So maybe, just maybe, it could have had something to do with his father, or the big guy, being vice president at the time. And maybe that could have something to do with all of the billions that are going to Ukraine. So excuse us for not being overly enthusiastic about the idea of forgetting about the Hunter Biden situation and pardoning him. Trump, on the other hand, has been systematically attacked since day one. They have thrown everything at him, from Russia collusion to washed up porn stars to documents and more. They have tried their absolute best to get him on something, whilst doing their absolute best to protect the Biden family. And that's why it's a false equivalence. On to the next.
Iowa's former U.S. Representative Steve King endorsed your campaign last night. Steve King was voted out of office by Iowa Republicans in the state's most conservative district. Do you think it helps your campaign to align yourself with him?
I think it helps to have his endorsement, in the sense that it helps to have anybody who's aligned with your own views and vision to say publicly that they support you. I'm proud to have his endorsement. I also think a lot of the media's narrative, I've gotten to know him. I didn't know him before this race. I've only gotten to know him in the last couple of months. But I will tell you, he has earned my trust for me to be able to say, when he tells me what the New York Times and others reported about him was downright false, I believe him sooner than I believe the New York Times, because I've had my experiences with both. I think he's an honest, direct, plain-spoken, and good-hearted patriot for this country. I'm proud to have his endorsement. And I think we've found common cause on a lot of other issues that other Republican candidates have been unwilling to touch, from the CO2 pipelines, illegal use of eminent domain to seize farmland from innocent farmers in this state, to, yes, my view that we do need border security. He was called racist in part for calling for building the wall before that was popular. Well, now that's actually mainstream thinking in both major political parties. And so in some ways, I think he was ahead of his time. He's not only, I think, a thoughtful man, but a person who cares about this country, and I'm proud to have his endorsement.
Steve King was stripped of his committee assignments in 2019. You mentioned the New York Times. He was quoted as saying, white nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? Do you agree with those comments?
Well, I think that I take Steve King's words over the New York Times that he didn't say those things. And I've had my own experiences with the media, and I understand that if Steve King, who I've gotten to know, and I really believe that this is an honest man, is a patriot who cares about speaking the truth, versus some New York Times reporter who hasn't offered a shred of evidence that he said such a thing. First of all, let's start with that. I don't even think those are the facts. I think there's something deeper, though. And I actually was looking at this because someone sent this to me last night after a lot of the backlash relating to the Steve King endorsement. They sent a whole New York Times compilation of all the racist things he said, supposedly racist things he said. Well, actually, some of them are just calling for basic border security in the United States, calling for English as the national language in the United States, pointing out the criminality of many people who have come to this country illegally. A lot of that isn't racist at all. And so when you take a look at the New York Times' compilation of all of the supposedly racist things he said, I'd encourage people to do that. Maybe I'll post it today. People can judge for themselves. Is that really racist, or is this a man who's actually speaking his convictions that are true and good-hearted, that the mainstream media, and the New York Times in this case in particular, has decided to label as a word that they know will alienate people? That's not the cancel culture we want in our country. Have the open debate. Maybe you disagree that English should be the national language of the United States, but let's have that debate in the open instead of castigating somebody and making them a pariah. People asked me even last night, will you denounce white supremacy? We live in a moment where, don't forget, a lot of the left has defined white supremacy to include things like punctuality or the written word. This is just as of a couple of years ago. Even many in the DEI Academy, in academia and otherwise, have said concepts like this are vestiges of white supremacy. These words have ceased to mean anything. And so if somebody wants to define white supremacy for me, then we can actually have a serious conversation about it. But until then, I think a lot of this is actually a charade. I think Steve King was defeated in part because of a donor establishment that used a toxic influence on money in politics to be able to disfavor him. But this is somebody who I believe is a patriot. I'm proud to have his endorsement. I'm not afraid to say it, and I think that that's what makes me different than a lot of the other candidates.
Let's talk about white supremacy and what happened last night for a moment, because when you were talking to reporters last night, you called white supremacy a myth. When someone asked you about Dylan Roof, you said you didn't know who that is. Have you looked up what happened in 2015?
Yeah, look, I said this last night. Invidious racial discrimination is wrong no matter how it happens. But if a Washington Post reporter is asking me almost like a catechism, whatever question I said, I'm against invidious racial discrimination, whatever form it takes, but says, do you denounce white supremacy? It's incumbent on us for us to define what white supremacy is. I wrote my book, Woke Inc., and I've written about the detailed understanding of what the popular understanding of these terms have come to mean. Do you believe punctuality is a vestige of white supremacy, Dasha?
Look,
because if you don't, then you have a disagreement about many of the people who are defining those terms, or the written word, or the use, or the nuclear family. These aren't my words. These are the words of intellectual proponents from Ibram Kendi to the Ayanna Presleys to BLM that have said these are vestiges of white supremacy. So
Mr. Ramaswamy,
we can't have it both ways.
What you do, though.
So in this lady's defense, Vivek actually should defend the charge of white supremacy with all of his might, because you can see just by looking at Vivek Ramaswamy that this is a guy who probably loves himself a bit of white supremacy. But seriously, he's on the money here and giving perfect responses. I mean, white supremacy is a term that's thrown around more than Logan Paul's fiance. Have a look at this one article from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Just as one example, the bias of professionalism standards. Professionalism has become coded language for white favoritism in workplace practices that more often than not privilege the values of white and Western employees and leave behind people of color. The standards of professionalism, according to American grassroots organizer scholars Tima Okun and Keith Jones, are heavily defined by white supremacy culture, or the systemic, institutionalized centering of whiteness. In the workplace, white supremacy culture explicitly and implicitly privileges whiteness and discriminates against non-Western and non-white professionalism standards related to dress code, speech, work, style, and timeliness. That is objectively racist. So I'm Italian. Does this mean that I can just turn up to work at 1 p.m. and if anybody complains, I can say that they're racist and this is not culturally inclusive because this is what we do in Sicily? And moreover, they talked about the English language being the national language of America. I have no idea how this is controversial. No shit, that should be the national language. In order for a country to be even remotely unified, you must, at the very least, be able to speak the same language so you can have dialogue with each other. It is just a fundamental thing that people should be able to have in common. It doesn't have to be your first language, but you should be able to speak the language. The conversation continues.
You have to have an honest discussion.
Straw man arguments.
Last night you brought
up Jussie Smollett as the best example
Smollett
of white
was the hottest thing in news in the back of a fake actual attack on him that we have to contend with.
And yet you have examples like the Buffalo shooter in New York just in 2022.
You have other examples.
But you are also cherry picking when you bring up Jussie Smollett.
I'll look at all of the statistics. More black on black crime. If you really care about actual crime against black Americans, let's get to the root causes of it in the inner cities of this country.
The Anti-Defamation League tracked a 38% increase in white supremacist propaganda last year.
Who's tracking that?
The Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah, the ADL, I don't think is a particularly credible source when they have a cherry-picked information.
When we're talking about
I would suggest look at there's a table, 2x2 table, federal law enforcement data, which you could say what you do. Maybe we shouldn't believe that either. But look at black on Asian crime, black on black crime,
the FBI
white on
hate
black
crime statistics. That's a law enforcement agency. 59.1% was based on race, ethnicity, and ancestry, saying hate crimes rose 12% between 2020 and 2021.
Look at the absolute crimes themselves. What they classify as a hate crime is itself a political judgment. I think that when you actually care about protecting life, if you want to say Black Lives Matter, let's look at where black lives are actually being lost. It's in the cities at the heart of other black Americans and criminals that are restrained by the absence
that we talk about as well. But are we supposed to ignore white supremacist hate crimes?
We're not supposed to ignore any kind of crime, Dasha. That's what I say. But what I see is a selective reporting. Take the Nashville Transgender Shooter Manifesto. Every shooter manifesto in a mass shooting has been released within 48 hours, except for that one shooter in Nashville. Now, it ended up being leaked. What do you see? It wasn't a white supremacist. It was somebody that was actually making fun of using derogatory terms. I believe.
So why are you okay talking about that manifesto and not talking about the manifesto from the 2015?
I'm more than okay talking about both. But what I'm asking is, why is the mainstream media suppress that one? Why did the police suppress that one? Why was that the one shooter manifesto that of all of the mass shootings, every other shooter manifesto has been released? I'm focused on that one because that's the one that's been hidden from us. And it comes back to the point of my candidacy and the way I'm going to run this country. Trust the people with the truth.
Anybody who favorably quotes the ADL is a spy. Change my mind. And also, the term hate crime is the dumbest in the world. And it's just a way of fueling division. I mean, what's the alternative to a hate crime? A love crime?
I'm so in love with you.
No, it's just ridiculous because crimes are generally motivated by things that aren't very nice. And it's best to just treat them as what they are and not politicize them. So that's it for me today, guys. As usual, you can find me below. Reach out if you'd like. If you want to subscribe to the channel, right here. And if you'd like to watch another video, right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.